real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Romas with you. We are coming up to Remembrance Day, and I've got a number of guests lined up to talk about service and sacrifice. We are going to talk about their experiences in training and deployments, the memories, the people, and impacts of service. I've also got my American co-host returning. John Simpson is here. John is a veteran of the U.S. Army with over 40 years of practical experience. He's an instructor with Snipercraft Incorporated and a research historian who has authored several books on the fundamentals and advanced tactics of marksmanship and sniper skills. I will also put in a bunch of links in the episode description to several of the books he's authored. That brings us to our guest today, who is retired Sergeant Major Erik Zipperer. Erik spent 23 years with the U.S. Army, focusing on infantry, special forces, and special operations. His experiences include training and combat deployments across 6 continents in every environment imaginable, from the Arctic to the desert, in jungles to mountainous regions, with deep experience in Latin America and Europe. Since retirement in 2001, Erik has continued to advise the Department of Defense and U.S. SOCOM on advanced operational and technological subjects. So welcome to you guys.
Thanks, Nathan.
Yep, good to be back.
Glad to have you guys here. It's always fun talking to people about their experiences. So we'll kind of dive into it because you've been to a lot of places and got a lot of history. So we'll start at the beginning, Erik, and just tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, something about your family, and what kind of led you into a life of service.
Sounds good, Nathan. I was born and raised in the state of Georgia. And my family were all school teachers. My father was a school teacher for a long time and then changed to another government job. But I grew up on a farm after the first 7 years. We lived in North Georgia, and then we moved down to my mother's family farm near where my father's from, right on the Florida border. So very hot, flat farming area, right? And together we got about 600 acres with an uncle that was next door. And we raised all type of animals, cattle, goats, chickens, ended up with about 56 head of cattle. And my main job, being the youngest of 5, was to maintain the fences, build up pastures, along with the farmland that we have, that gets leased out to a farmer. So I grew up running around in the woods from the time I was 3 years old, started shooting when I was about 5. And then from the time I was 8 years old, living down on the farm, I was able to go out and run around with, fishing gear or firearms and, spears, tomahawks, whatever I wanted to. As long as I checked in and followed the procedures, the safety protocols and things for the family and kept them informed. And that's pretty much how my life went up until I went in the military at 18, enlisted at 17 and at 18. And so in your questionnaire, you have, why'd you join the military? And the joke I always tell is, I think it might have been a bump on the head when I was about 6. Fell from a tree, I'm not sure. But I always wanted to do it. And there was no question in my mind. It was just, how do I keep my parents from trying to get me to become a lawyer or a doctor or something like that? And so the Vietnam War was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Playing Army is a big thing. Playing Cowboys and Indians is a big thing in the rural areas where I grew up. And so doing that was a natural progression for me. So everything about what I was doing as hobbies and physical activities was with that thought in mind. So played 4 years of high school football on a losing team and wasn't that great of a football player. Ran track for several years and lettered in track. But as we get into the questionnaire of how was the military training? That's why I wanted to give that background, because when you're in South Georgia and you're playing football, you start in August when it's 100 degrees out and 50, 60% humidity if you're lucky. And you're in half gear, the pads, shoulder pads and stuff, hitting dummies or hitting each other and running wind sprints, in the evening, starting in August through September when it's, 90, 95 degrees out. And in the case of my coaches, we actually had a Vietnam vet helicopter pilot come straight out of the Army, and he was our coach.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, that was helpful. And then at the end of Vietnam, around 73, knowing people like my next door neighbor came back from being an infantry platoon leader during that time. The preacher in my small hometown church was an Air Force pararescue man, and so having those inspirational stories, much like probably John, most everybody that was a mentor in our neighborhood, the deacons, the teachers, were all World War II vets, North Korean vets.
Okay.
And in a couple of cases, fresh Vietnam vet, school teacher, with all the stories they had of seeing the world and doing things.
So you're really surrounded by this stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
With Vietnam just ending, did your parents or anybody, like, with all the narratives kind of surrounding that stuff, did your parents kind of say, like, we don't want you to go that direction, or did anybody try to steer you clear?
Yeah, certainly post-Vietnam in the 70s, the military was not seen in a favorable light. They recognized how the troops and the conflict had been mismanaged by the government. And there were a lot of bad tales coming out of how bad the morale was, especially in the Army. My father had been in World War II in the Navy, had a cushy job in Hawaii the whole time. His brothers had all been in the Army, North Africa, Europe, Japan, and had seen a lot of combat in the case of one of them especially. And then I had another uncle who was a Navy minesweeper captain.
Okay.
So had a lot of those tales, around the Thanksgivings and things, large families. And again, many of my peers' fathers were, World War II vets. And so we always had those stories going around.
Okay.
But Vietnam had ended. It was a nightly thing. I don't know how everyone was, but for us, my dad would take a break from the yard work after his normal 9-to-5 job, and we would watch the evening news, possibly both channels that we could get on the little, rabbit ear thing we had. But we'd watch the evening news with Walter Cronkite and all those well-known personalities, giving their interpretation of how things were going.
Okay.
And seeing that. And so at the end of that, we had recruiters come because recruitment was going so badly in the early 70s. And that's where I'll lead in with, how mixed up I was. In 73, I was 13. The recruiters came with the helicopter and the armored vehicles to the high school to try and recruit guys. And I walked over there at 13 and met the recruiter and said, I'm ready to go. So I was done with school. I've done a lot more learning being around John and being around some other brilliant people since I've retired than I did in my high school years. I was ready to go. I was ready to leave that small town and go see the world. And the recruiter straightened me out and said, come back in 4 years. And so he asked me a funny tale. He's like, so I guess you grew up shooting and all this, and you can shoot a fly off a running hog in 100 yards. And I went, I'm not sure why anyone would want to shoot a fly off of a running hog at 100 yards, but I can certainly hit the hog running at 100 yards. And I wasn't exaggerating. And that was one of my major pastimes, was bumping into wild hogs back in the swamps in our farm and, bringing them home for barbecue.
Kind of with your upbringing and stuff, it sounds like, your work ethic was already there. It was instilled in you, and you had kind of some more drive. You knew what you wanted to do. Maybe we don't see that quite as much nowadays, but it sounds like obviously that lifestyle kind of led you just naturally in this direction.
Right, it did, and it's because that was my goal, and that'll come out in the theme here is you You choose your direction. John often asks me, how are you doing, Zip? I go, I'm living the dream. I'm retired. I'm living in a beautiful area. I've got, 6 children. They're doing great. 3 of them are still in high school age, teenagers. And so I'm living the dream because that's what I visioned, and that's what I chose within the constructs and restrictions of the government forms you have to fill out to pursue whichever goal you'd like to pursue.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the way it went in those years. And yes, it was helpful being able to have those resources. The discipline, strict disciplinarian, but it was kind of strange. Avid reader. My father, got the encyclopedias. We all had access to that if we had the city library or the county library, and encouraged to read a lot. So had read about all the adventures, had watched the movies of the adventures of people, and I'm an amateur historian. And I come to John for the real truth on what the history was of certain eras, and we argue about it for an hour. So I did that, and then approached my parents and said, how supportive was the family of that choice? Well, I was 17, doing what we had at the time known as delayed entry. You enter, and unless there's a national emergency, you can delay it for up to 9 or 12 months. I can't recall, but mine was about 9 months. I enlisted in April of 78, and I went in February of 79.
Okay. So you're doing training. You just won't get sent overseas if something comes up unless it's national emergency.
No, that would be by exception. Like if 9/11 happened and you had been on, inactive reserves, they call it.
Okay.
Delayed entry, then they probably would have said, okay, go report to your station for training and deployment is going to proceed earlier. But that didn't happen. I was 17 and I had to get my family to sign the papers. So my parents balked at it. They didn't really want to do that and tried to encourage me to stay and go to college like all my siblings had and take ROTC, do something different. Any service but the Army was what my father was pushing for.
Okay.
And so being a teenager, I ignored all of that. And I said, in 3 months, 3.5, 4 months, I'm going to be 18 and I'm going to sign the papers myself. So you can sign them now, and or you can wait and I'll sign them in July. But that's what's going to happen because graduation was coming up from high school. And I'd already determined I was not going to spend another 4 years sitting at a desk in some classroom somewhere.
And you're the only one out of your siblings who went this direction? Like everyone else went to college or some other job?
Correct. Yeah. And the neat thing that I tell in telling my story of seeing the world is I have 2 older siblings whose father was in the Army Air Corps. That's my mother's first husband.
Okay.
And in the about 1953 timeframe, he died in Alaska in one of the first jets. I can't remember, F-36, I think it was, the Shooting Star. And so they were living in Alaska, and she was pregnant with my brother when her husband got killed. So I got to see that, and that got my brother a deferment from going to Vietnam as an only surviving son. He didn't have to go. He pursued a college education and played football at the University of Georgia, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So I had a third set of their grandparents from Iowa. And my father had close Navy friends in Chicago. So we traveled a lot around the country, and that was encouraged in our family. We would host international people when I was a kid growing up. Exchange students would come over from Italy or from the UK.
You have early experience getting exposed to other cultures and different people. So very cool.
Yeah.
Just kind of moving into some of the training and when you're applying, actually, maybe we'll just kind of start there. But what was it like? So when you actually get to go and finally sign the papers and now you're kind of off, is this like you're leaving home and you're living somewhere else right off the bat? And, kind of what was that experience like?
Well, the delayed part, yeah, we go to each state, you go to a induction center, or it might be multiple states, but in our case, it's Atlanta, Georgia, which is about a 3-hour drive or a bus ride of 5 or 6 hours, depending on how many times you stop. And they bus a whole bunch of us up there on a Trailways bus at the time. And then we rode it back after doing the in processing, the physicals, and all that, and went back to school, came back and went back to school that day after we were done. And then the actual entry, yeah, that was fairly emotional for my mother, especially when I drove off. And of course, it was exciting. You know, you're going in early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, arriving at Fort Jackson. And then we shipped over from Fort Jackson, South Carolina, to back to Fort Benning, Georgia. So they do paperwork drills and get you in little groups, and then the different military occupational specialties get sent to the base that trains that. So that's what I did. I went to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic infantry. But I'll back up a step, Nathan. We the weird thing about our career, and John's, I believe, fairly similar, is we had a contract because of a shortage in special forces, and that's not knowing what the political moves are. We had a contract from the time we entered to go to a special forces team, potentially as a private, if you accomplish the goals of get your basic military specialty of infantry, in my case, go to jump school, pass that, and then go directly to Fort Bragg to the Special Forces course and successfully complete the Special Forces course, which was 4 months at the time, with an additional 6 weeks on the front end for me, because I got there in time to do pre-phase, we called it pre-training, for about 6 weeks. So that's what happened with me. Is went through the basic, and in your questionnaire it says, well, how did you think about the training? And well, it was about what I expected, maybe harder in some areas, maybe not as hard. I certainly didn't study enough mathematics and things, but luckily they have formulas for the job specialties that you get down to memorize to be able to handle what math you need when you're going to, in my case, fire mortars, align mortars, be a forward observer, plot the firing tables and things like that. So it's on the job training, repetitive, making sure that you get it down and you pass those wickets.
So it's important to point out at this time when this was going on. This was before we had the Special Forces branch and the Special Forces command. Okay, so what Zip is talking about, there were a certain number of MOSs that you would enlist for. So there was 11B for light weapons infantrymen, 11 Charlie for indirect fire crewmen. There was 12B for combat engineer. There was 05B for communications, and there was 91 Bravo for medic.
Oh, okay.
And you would enlist. You'd enlist under that MOS. You go to basic training, then you go to your advanced individual training, your AIT. So, I was an 11B, Zip was an 11 Charlie. We both wound up taking AIT at Fort Benning. If you were a medic, you went to
Fort Sam Houston, London.
Yeah, Fort Sam Houston in Texas. If you were a commo, I think you went to Fort Gordon, Georgia.
Yep.
And right, so you graduate that, and then under the Special Forces enlistment option, they then you would automatically attend jump school. And then once you pass that, then you would get on a bus and go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and you would check. They don't do it this way. I don't believe they do it this way anymore. They used to have an area up in the First Corps Support Command.
Right, that's where I went through. Yeah,
that's where pre-phase happened, and that was a detail that there used to be the 5th and 7th Special Forces groups on Fort Bragg, and there would be detail, post details that they had to do. And so a team, for an active team from one of the groups, would get tasked to go over to the first COSCOM area and just train the guys that had come in. Because with a whole bunch of privates coming in, it's like, well, we didn't know that much about map reading, and we didn't know that much about land nav, and we needed a lot of PT. And it was the SF. The last thing I'll say is the SF enlistment option was actually a pretty good deal for the Army. And Zip and I were just talking about this because
Yep.
you come in in like what I call a Green Army MOS. Okay, so at the end of the day, you know, after AIT, you're an 11B rifleman. Okay. And if you go to jump school and you can't learn how to jump out of planes, the Army still has a rifleman that they can send to like the 1st Infantry Division or the 2nd Infantry Division.
Who has to pay the government back his enlistment bonus for failing to meet the obligations of a contract.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and then if you pass jump school and you don't make it through SF training, then the 82nd Airborne just got themselves a brand new paratrooper. Okay, so it was a good deal, and you could like fall by the wayside at any time. So yeah, but that was the Special Forces enlistment option at the time when we went in. There was for those people that are familiar with U.S. Spec Ops today, there was no selection to get into SF. Okay, there was no selection and assessment. It was a case of you were being selected and assessed throughout the entire 16 weeks of the Special Forces qualification course. So there were 3 phases at that time. You could be dropped at any phase, and that was actually one of the reasons why they had why they instituted selection, because people were like volunteering for SF to get out of their current assignment. They would go to Fort Bragg, fail out of the Q course, and then they would like wind up getting assigned somewhere else.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, and then it wasn't 16 weeks for the medics because they went off on their whole other track.
They do another whole year of training and clinicals.
Yeah, they spent about a year becoming SF qualified.
So for you, Erik, for your path, like when you get into training, how long are you in training before they start deploying you in your capacity, I guess, or in your specialization?
Well, it would be. I would say they'd probably do composite teams, but I wouldn't say that. I'm not sure. Okay, I think there are probably teams that went right to teams and then to deployments, and I'll give you a little more background on that as we go along.
I think to answer Nathan's question, if I can jump in here, just to give you an example from my own experience. So I did the delayed enlistment program just like Zip did. I reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina in September of 1977. Okay. I graduated the Special Forces qualification course on 9 November 1978. And then I reported to Fort Devens, Massachusetts in December.
Yep.
And I was assigned to a team, and then that February, I want to say, I went on my first real world deployment with ODA 325 out of the 10th Special Forces Group, and it was on a joint combined training exercise with the Italian Army in Corvara.
Okay, so things can happen pretty quick.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
You can. Yeah, I mean, you'll show it. You can show up to a team, and you could deploy after a workup.
Okay. Later, I'll tell you my personal experience in seeing that was when I was in Special Operations Command. We have a longer course of 6 months. Some guys are, most are Special Forces qualified. Some are not. They literally graduate a class while we're in Panama conducting Operation Just Cause.
Okay.
And I had previously been in classes with a couple of them, knew them personally from 10th Special Forces Group earlier in my career. They hand them all over to me one night and say, okay, we want these guys to get a combat operation. You guys are going out to the border region, south in the country, load them on your helicopter, and Zip, you're in charge of the ground force commander. If anything goes wrong, we got the officer and the other bird. And I get a whole bunch of new students. Now, most of these guys were E5, sergeants and staff sergeants, but they literally had graduated their course the day and a half prior.
Okay.
Got their kit, joined us down there in combat operations, and we took them out on a test run, fairly benign. Later in the conflict, to give them that feeling. Very often, we have guys deploy right to a combat operation. In that case, more senior guys, and I'll say, from what I understand, the Ranger Regiment jumping into Grenada, they might not pick the guys that just came over. But sometimes they do. Sometimes it's guys straight that aren't yet Ranger qualified. They're a member of the, Ranger Regiment or Ranger Battalion, and they go right in on those jumps with what training they have and incorporated into the organization with the leadership that they have.
Okay.
So I'm going to divert a couple of quick things because it's kind of funny. I got to go and do hometown recruiting for 3 months after I graduated. And you ask about the training and how the training meet expectations. It was hot, it was miserable, but it was humorous to me because I was born and raised in Georgia, and it's like throwing Brer Rabbit back in the briar patch, The guys are complaining about the heat and the humidity. Well, I was there from February until April, June, going through jump school. And I'm hearing the guys complain about the heat in June, and I'm laughing at them.
Yeah.
And just teasing them because they'll walk us under showers in jump school and mist us down with water to make sure we don't get too hot. And I'm like, well, if you don't pass jump school here in June and they recycle you and you have to go again in July or August, you're really going to be miserable.
Yeah.
But then when I graduated jump school in June of 79 timeframe, I got hometown recruiter. It was a program where they try and get people to help out. It's fairly silly, I think. They ought to use a more senior guy to be a recruiter that actually knows something about the Army. But I went from jump school right back to my parents' house for a month. And then I extended for another month. The recruiters liked me, and I was doing a good job as a recruiter's aide. I got to do the maximum time, which was 3 months. And they reported me AWOL 2 times at Fort Bragg for failing to show up at Fort Bragg before the days of computers. It was just paper orders. They'd have me AWOL for a couple of days. I was notorious. I was a legend by the time I got there. And the time I stepped off, I drove my own car when I went to Fort Bragg at the end of the 90 days. When I drove up there and showed up, I was getting my butt chewed. And the first sergeant, everybody knew me by my name, odd name anyway. And now I've been AWOL for 60 days as far as they know, except they thought it was funny because each time the orders would catch up after I'd been reported AWOL. All this is totally unknown to me. So now I'd been at home, probably not as disciplined as sticking to the regimen of 6 days a week of physical fitness, eating very filling food, fried chicken and biscuits and everything from South Georgia. And I'd gained probably 10 or 15 pounds. So after gaining that weight, now I go into this pre-phase, Nathan, of, an hour and a half of calisthenics, trying to wash out anybody that really doesn't want to be special forces as the class fills up to 150. Well, as the class fills up from the 10 that were there when I showed up to 150, we'd lose 10, 20 a week.
Oh, really?
So we probably had 200 to get down to 150 at the end of the 6 weeks. And the first 2 days, I'm doing calisthenics. I'm out of shape doing wind sprints. I do what I'd, been known to do during track season. I push myself too hard trying to show off and stick with everybody. I'm getting cramps and everything. I run over to the corner of the field and throw up, And the NCOs are all like, I guess you want to quit. I guess you want to quit. I go, no, this is like every day at football practice for me. Let's go more wind sprints, And so that, and then it was 8 hours a day of classes, as John mentioned, in land navigation or whatever MOS is, because we have to also cross train and learn a little bit about engineering and a little bit about communications, medical. Everyone gets medical. And then end the day with a 5-mile ruck march.
Wow.
With probably a 60-pound ruck, I would guess, 60, 65, somewhere in there. And a lot of times the older guys coming from other places didn't like us that were young and gung-ho and didn't know anything, but we could run fast, So there would be those types of conflicts.
Yeah.
And going through the trial. And John mentioned, I was slotted to be a heavy weapons sergeant. So imagine I get done in April and I show up to 10th Special Forces Group as a private first class with only a year in the Army, and I'm going to be the heavy weapons sergeant for a Special Forces team.
It made some people angry.
Right. Well, it was what it was. And so the way I interpret it was they would send us off to a lot of schools to give us more opportunities to stay away. And very often they would do composite team movements to have more senior guys in training events. But it was a great experience. When I got there in April, the whole Special Forces Group, John included, were deployed on that exercise he was describing earlier, I believe, the Flintlock, which is an annual thing. And there was no one around the company except the first guy I meet, which is a fellow by the name of Richard Ferguson. And so Fergie and I couldn't be more different, except we're both aggressive when we like to do fun things that might get you killed. And so Fergie was a staff sergeant who I believe had been in the 82nd before. I know his brother was in the 82nd, but he was from Rhode Island, of all places. And he spoke with a Rhode Island accent. And I ended up going with his team to training and spent 3 weeks down at Fort Bragg with him in June. And by July of that year, I'm sitting at his parents' house for the 4th of July, partying in Rhode Island with his brother, jumping off cliffs into quarry lakes and things that rednecks in Rhode Island do. And but Richard, I'm throwing him in there because literally the first guy I met about a year after I retired, I read his name on the casualty list where Fergie got killed in Iraq on the push into Baghdad.
Oh, wow.
And I hadn't seen him in 15 years. I thought he had retired before I had. But no, Master Sergeant Ferguson, got involved in a vehicle rollover during combat operations heading up through Basra on the way to Baghdad and got killed, I think 2000. But and then the next guy I meet had just come back from a school, and he's I'm just going to call him Crazy Dave. Crazy Dave introduces himself to me, and he's got this huge handlebar mustache. And this is a segue lead into mentorship of the type that we had throughout our career. I could talk about the team sergeant of the team that put us through the training John mentioned. It was a team that was run by a crusty master sergeant. He was also a great mentor, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name. He had previously been a major who got rifted after the Vietnam War from a combat commission and had been a major, and they made him a master sergeant. And so you hear these stories with these guys with all the badges and combat stories that they have, and you listen to them because what they say generally is fairly wise, and it's probably not in the book.
Yeah.
And that's the way Dave introduces himself. He's got a big handlebar mustache. When he talks, his mustache goes up and down like this. Hilarious guy. And we hit it off. He's from North Carolina, and I had heard some stories about him previously, and I advised him that if he tried to pull any of those jokes on me, that I might hit him with a 2x4. And so when I told him that, we got along real well after that, and I never had to hit him with a 2x4. But he was a Vietnam vet, but he'd been like a corporal, a Spec 4 corporal radio operator in Vietnam, knew the radio operator business inside out, made sure that I knew it later when I went back and got cross-trained as a radio operator. But Dave's example of mentorship was, now here are these new guys in the company, and Dave's going to teach them about sapper training and true camouflage. So he has a block of instruction my first month or so there, where we are told to go down to the pawn shop, buy old rucksacks, buy old load-bearing equipment, the harnesses, the kit, and that's going to be ours because we're going to spray paint it all. And we lay everything out there and spray paint it. And then we get straps for our rifles and we spray paint those. And so taught how to, do with less, just carry a Claymore bag with the ammo and the grenades in that, maybe another Claymore bag with the canteen in it to go lighter and be stealthy. And then that would move on up into practical exercises of actually going on practice assaults against Marine Corps reservists from Massachusetts, in our case. The days after I left being John's roommate that we'll describe here in a little bit, we went and assaulted these Marines, and it was just a series of bad events for me. I had a malfunction on my parachute, and I had to fire off my reserve, which opened at literally treetop level, and I went feet, knees, and face into the ground and busted my head a little bit on the forehead.
Jeez.
That before we went in and assaulted the Marines that were dug in on a ridge line that night. And that turned into a melee of hand to hand with a grenade simulator going off right in front of me and me catching a secondary projectile rock in the chest and getting blinded by the grenade simulator, where I then got really angry and apparently assaulted a few Marines in their holes. And so then the team packed me up and said, "You're having a bad night. Just go home before you get arrested or the Marines have you, court-martialed." And I went back, packed up, and went to Fort Bragg for 3 more months of radio operator training. So that's how they would do it. That's how they would deal with the young guys. They'd send you off to school after school.
Yeah.
One of the other mentors, and John will resonate with this, was the big heroes to us, even though we were ignorant for the most part. I was, John probably wasn't, were the Sante Raiders and the MACV-SOG guys in Vietnam. That's our lineage, right? And so much of that MACV-SOG wasn't declassified until the mid-90s, late 90s. We might hear it around the bar from the master sergeants when we're up there at Fort Bragg, but they're just going to talk around the fringes of it. And the stories are so unbelievable that you think that maybe they were lying until you get in writing and you see the documentaries 20 years later and you go, I remember this story from the bar. And in the case of the Sante Raiders, well, I got picked early in June to go to a school with Fergie and his team called SOT Mott Lake that John may have discussed with you. And it was the blue light guys that were supposed to be doing counterterrorism training. Everybody in Special Forces gets to train on. And it was, for me, it was the epitome of toughness, hardness, June, July in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It's like being in an oven. And much like our Special Forces barracks, they were tar paper shacks on concrete pads, black tar paper with wood. Was there air conditioning? Absolutely not. Was there hot water in the Special Forces qualification course at Camp McCall? Absolutely not. We washed our clothes in cold water in December on washboards by hand.
Wow.
And we had a little stove in the tar paper shacks at Camp McCall. Well, at Mott Lake, it's 95 degrees out, and these black tar paper shacks are solar loading all day long. And you've just got some windows, some screens for the air to pass through. That's it.
You almost sound like the forgotten about unit in the Army or something, like you're just stuck in the past.
And most of us, you didn't know which one to believe, Nathan. Many of the old veterans are saying they're going to disband special forces altogether. All of the conventional military hates us, and they'll show their hatred to you, and they'll express their hatred to you by how slovenly you dress, how disrespectful you are. If you fail to salute, you don't have spit shine boots. And then there's the other smarter guys who are like, nope, we're getting ready to grow special forces. Well, the politically connected and intelligent guys were watching what was happening in Washington. And in fact, my first year up there, they stood up another special forces group when they started standing up first group out in Fort Lewis. And they raped our teams. They took a team out of every company. We went from 6 teams per company, 6 12-man teams per company, to 5 teams per company. So it was a lot for a young guy that's going through school after school, training mission after training mission to follow when you're just worrying about how bad you really suck at being an 11 Charlie, at being a mortar guy with no experience, when you've got team sergeants that were firing mortars in Vietnam just a decade before, every day.
If I can, because you were mentioning a little earlier, just where you met John.
Right.
Can you tell a story of how you two know each other? Like where was the connection?
Yeah, it's hilarious. One of the ways they would get rid of us youngsters to get us out of their hair is reservists during the summer here in the U.S. Reservists and National Guardsmen go to their state camps and bases to get their 3 weeks or a month worth of training. And that's where they all come together and do Army things, instead of just their weekend drills. And one of those places in our region was Camp Drum, New York, outside Watertown, New York, which is now known as Fort Drum, New York. But back then, it looked like it was going to be totally closed down, and it was just old wooden World War II barracks. And I show up there from my company, John's from a company down the street, and we both got sent there for 1 month of temporary duty. And that was to be range control, non-commissioned officers. Well, the problem was I was a private, right?
Yeah, and I was a private first class.
Right. Yeah, I think, we were both private first class then. Yeah. I made it right after coming out of the Q course. I think they made me a PFC. So we're supposed to be sergeants, 2 ranks higher. And for all intents and purposes, for everybody at Camp Drum, we were sergeants. Okay. But that wasn't exactly the case. And so we had to go in and inspect these units using our expertise as special forces guys to make sure they were doing it safely, and they cleaned up their trash, and they didn't fire artillery or mortars into downtown Watertown or one of the small villages, Genesee, one of the little towns outside of there. And every day we would be tasked multiple times a day to drive our Jeep, inspect the ranges, and clear those units to leave the range or not. And in my case, it became an R not with a Marine unit. We got in a big argument, and I got reported for insubordination. And then my boss, the major, went out there and chewed the Marines out, and it all worked out in the end.
Yeah, so Zip was driving around with a Jeep and a clipboard, and I was back at range control headquarters on the radio, and I was like the voice of range control, opening and closing ranges and handling message traffic.
Yeah.
And it's important to emphasize, one of the good things about a group at the time is when they were sending 2 PFCs off to a National Guard, an Army Reserve base to be NCOs, they cut us orders saying that we were Sergeant Simpson and Sergeant Zipperer, and they handed us sergeant rank to pin on. So we were basically frocked as sergeants in everything but our ID cards when we went on that trip.
Yeah, and the orders there read that way. So that was a great experience for later in my career. And you can read about Vietnam guys. When I ended up going to a combat zone, a hostile fire zone that later became a combat zone, I was a buck sergeant. Now, in Latin America, man, officers and NCOs deal with each other a lot differently.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
to have an NCO, a sergeant, talking to a captain in the Salvadoran army or the Honduran army, they just are not comfortable with that guy leading a platoon or being the advisor of a platoon. And you have to be careful about how you address them and recognize the differences. Our NCO Corps, and we'll talk about that in some of the questions of dealing with other militaries. So it was helpful to have that experience to be thrust into that. I literally run into guys I went through basic training with who are still privates looking at me wearing sergeant rank going, how did this happen? And I'm like, well, you see the beret, that's how it happened,
Uh-huh.
and they just assumed I was, 100% truthful. And that was probably a good recruiting thing to run into some of those cats from New York that I had gone through basic training with. But the other thing I'll mention, you have in here about dealing with the other militaries, and I told John I don't have an example of direct engagement with the Canadian military. I never had exchanges with them like I did with many other militaries.
Okay.
But we did get to see the Canadian airborne guys who came down there and advised in advisory roles and helped run ranges. And we sought them out as odd people in an odd place, paratroopers. We just kind of draw together, And so we would seek them out and we would listen to their war tales. And I think we engaged with them a couple of times on the range. But I was struck by the professionalism of the Canadian airborne guys at that time.
Yeah.
And then, as John joked, I was also struck by the beauty of the Canadian girls that were in the military that were there working for the airborne regiment. And so,
without exception.
Yeah, without exception. So I ended up having a girlfriend from Islington there in Toronto. And the following year, I went up and visited her at Petawawa at the airborne base.
Okay.
Again, I didn't engage much with the guys there because it was her showing me, the beautiful countryside and us going to Niagara Falls and, all that. But the proximity of Camp Drum, Fort Drum, is we just drive up the road to go to Lake Ontario and then go up to the Thousand Islands, cross over the border, on a Sunday afternoon, sit there and enjoy the wonderful Canadian brew and bring back several cases and, pack it back to Fort Devens later. So
maybe if we could kind of talk a little bit about the deployments, we'll move into that.
Right.
And then, I do kind of want to know about your experiences in Latin America, because that's a big component of what you had in the some of your experiences you sent over. So can you kind of highlight for us some of the deployments or places you've been, and just we'll go through that.
Yeah.
And if you get a chance to kind of tell us about how some of the, it's always fascinating to me to learn how it was interacting with the locals, in addition to the other militaries that you might be involved with, because I think that has a lot of impact on people. So if you could kind of let us know.
Yeah, I'll brush over the 10th group time fairly quickly, but I have to tell one funny story, and that is the question of deployment for a training deployment. Now, it's a major exercise, and the NCOs and the officers are graded heavily on this back in the time when there's not constant combat. The frustrations were for us, we joined special forces because, we think we want to get into all this action and stuff. And so in 10th group, there wasn't a lot happening. It's Cold War. I was focused specifically on the country of Poland with my team. Multiple, Czechoslovakia, everybody had their team focus. My team focus was Poland, and I was learning a little bit of Polish, from what I could. But then we had to go annually to Germany multiple times in that 2.5 years I went to Germany. And my first visit was on the major exercise in the spring. The other thing I'll add in is I grew up on the Florida border. I'd seen snow in North Georgia and in Iowa. And they ended up sending me to Alaska to Northern Warfare Training Course, Camp Greeley and Black Rapids and all these things to learn how to ski on these 210 wooden World War II, wooden skis with the wire bindings and the vapor barrier boots and living in 30 below. Same thing in Massachusetts. It's 20 below, 30 below. We go out to winter warfare. We deploy for that annually. That first year, one of my classmates who had graduated in my third phase, we were together for a month, died in New Hampshire during our winter warfare thing.
During the training?
During training.
Wow.
Yep. Sergeant Roman was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and they had hypothermia hit the whole team in a rainstorm. It went from 5 above zero Fahrenheit to about 35 degrees above zero and pouring rain. And so he got washed down an ice-covered stream and got trapped under some debris and perished.
Wow.
And so that training thing is real. And so now you fast forward to April, our major exercise that year, and we jump into Germany just like it was World War II. So I'm 20 years old, going to turn 21 in July, and we've been warned we're going to take about 30% casualties. That's just a given. On a train and jump, we're going to jump unmarked drop zones, no markings on the ground. They're looking out the window. There's not GPS for the aircraft. There certainly isn't for the jump master. And they're looking out the window at terrain features and roads and rivers. And they're saying, okay, we're over the drop zone. Green light comes on. Get out. There's no markings. It's like the Pathfinder version of D-Day, right? So we jump out, and we jumped into a clear-cut Douglas fir forest. My side was clear cut. The other side still had trees, and there was farm fields. I thought I was landing in an open pasture because of the darkness, and I was landing in stumps. And 2 of the guys landed there, one broken ankle, the other one had a hurt back. But the thing that got all of us was our buddy Bobby. We could hear him 200 meters away going, "I broke my effing leg." He's hung 30 feet up in the air with a compound fracture of the tibia fibula.
Wow.
And we take the next 3 hours getting him down out of there with ropes and pulleys. And we got no morphine. So there was our 25% casualties out of a 12-man team right there.
Jeez.
All 3 of them got back. It took us 4 hours, and we had 20 kilometers to go. And we had been weather delayed by 24 hours because of a technical problem with the equipment we had received. And so at daybreak, we had to move 20 kilometers during the hours of daylight with rain and mush and all this, crossing multiple ravines along a giant ravine to get to our target by midnight.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 3 guys down on equipment, and we had to cross-load all their equipment. Not one guy on that team could stand without assistance. And then once he stood, he had to walk with that 130 to 150 pound rucksack and do it for 20 kilometers to get to the target that night. We all ran out of water. And that was my introduction to a major special forces big exercise deployment. Successful. We hit our target. It was all good. And we stayed there for another 10 days or so, continuing to hit targets, living with the host nation, meeting the Germans. And that's the beauty of it. We would stay in their farmhouses. We're interacting with the farm families, and they're hiding us. And 2 groups of the families are fighting. All the conventional guys are married into the German culture. They're getting paid, bonuses and getting passes if they capture us. And then our people are paying a little bit and helping out the locals to hide the special forces guys. So you got the guys who like the special forces and the guys who hate the special forces from the German populace. And they're working against each other to either hide you or to capture you and get you, put in the gulag.
Yeah.
So we were dressed in that case, carrying AKs. And for all intents and purposes, we looked like Spetsnaz, and that was how the local military played it. And our role was, we're cutting off the Russians that have overrun this part of Germany. That was my introduction to Europe. No passport required. 3 of my buddies go to the hospital. And then when we got done with that exercise, that was when I got to meet the Brits over at Hereford, because my team sergeant had been there before. So we had a week or so to wait before we flew back to the U.S. We hopped a train and went to Hereford and partied with the other paratroopers for like 3 days nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
And then back to catch the plane back to the U.S. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So what kind of comes next in your career? So where's everything take you?
Yeah. What comes next is I'll blast through it quickly. I went over the next year. I got to go. They just declassified it here about 4 years ago. I got to go into Berlin, where our teams were hanging out for 40 years, classified and train urban stuff, get long hair. Now I'm only still a sergeant. And then I get to do scout swimmer training and go swim off the Cape Cod and all that. And then I become a no-kidding ski instructor my last year there with the 10th Special Forces Group course that lasted 3 weeks. I actually taught students, the majors and the master sergeants. Here I am, a buck sergeant from South Georgia with the accent I have, teaching skiing in New England.
Mm-hmm.
To include, I finished that up and went to Austria to the high alpine course. And that was another example of dealing with host nation country. Austria was not a part of NATO. So they would train the Spetsnaz for a month or two, and then we'd come in and train for a month or two. And they'd tease us about how the Spetsnaz were so much in better shape and all this.
Just for the listeners not familiar with it, Spetsnaz was the Russian special forces.
Yep. And so the young guys typically like the socialists. But I had an instructor there, a sergeant, who was 62, 63 years old, skiing up the mountain, going through the powder. We'd go to lunchtime, and then we'd get to the peak, and we'd have, some brochins and some cheese and some sausage. And then we'd wax up our skis and turn around and ski down through the mountains back down into Austria and down into the valley all day long, every day, if you weren't on a glacier for 3 or 4 days. And so I got that diploma as well, the Austrian High Alpine, Austrian Order of the High Alpinists. And when you say that quickly to an officer's wife who asks about your badge, it can be quite humorous.
At any point, did you ever come across any of this Spetsnaz? And was there like any, whether it was under fire or just even in training, like any crossover at all?
No, the guys did here recently. If I did, I don't know. And it's likely that I did in Latin America. I do know that I came across Cuban advisors later and met them, and we had words. And it was in an urban area where they weren't. They didn't appear to be armed anyway.
Okay.
It was during a long story, but it was during a like a break. The war in El Salvador is odd. It goes on for 10, 12 years. On the weekends, you go home to visit your parents. You got to cross lines and potentially get captured riding a public bus kind of thing. So we met some Cubans later. But there we don't know. We always assumed they were surveilling us at different places, but we don't know.
Yeah.
We did get to see plenty of East Germans for sure in Berlin. And they're right there on the wall as we're going and doing all that. But then, not to belabor it, but decided that it would be more interesting to do something where something was going on in El Salvador. So a bunch of us myself included, put in for language school, went for about 8 months of Spanish language training in California, and called the Department of the Army, wrote letters, sent flowers, anything I could do to get stationed in Panama, where the guys were going all the time on these deployments to El Salvador, Honduras, and the School of the Americas, which is all the Latin American militaries come up and train at the time, was right next door to our battalion. And so I was successful in that, lobbying to go from, the Arctic to Latin America.
Did you know much about El Salvador at that time?
Not a thing.
Or just sound like a better place?
No. Right. Yeah. I mean, I assumed if the balloon went up, the joke I always lay out is, I love the snow. I love the Arctic. It's a hard discipline. You make mistakes, you die.
Mm-hmm.
You can have that happen in the tropics too, and you can get all types of bad things happen to you. But I always joke that if things went bad in Latin America, I could always walk home, or paddle up around the Gulf of Mexico and go up the Apalachicola, So that was a joke, but it wasn't a total joke, because getting trapped in the Cold War in Poland after the Russians had run all the way to the coast didn't seem like a lot of fun, It was exciting, but so anyway, I get down there to Panama. I get scuba school on the way by going through Key West, and that's a form we fill out. If you're going from one duty station to another duty station, you get a chance to get like a bonus. Hey, you get to skip the lines, and because you're going overseas, we'll let you get a school en route. So I got scuba school en route.
Okay.
And ended up in the company that had scuba teams. And later, after being there about a year and a half, I was on a scuba team there in Panama, which is just, paradise.
Yeah.
We're lobstering every weekend on our own, renting scuba tanks or using our own snorkel gear whenever we're back and we're not in El Salvador or Honduras, or the other companies might be in Colombia or Peru, or training in the jungle when the units come up from those countries to work at the School Americas. And very often we do what we would call an MTT, mobile training team. And in the case of Panama, we would call it in-country MTT. You're not leaving home, but for 3 weeks, you're out in the jungle every day, training reconnaissance, training tactics, patrolling, those types of things in a jungle setting. Survival is all for Special Forces branch. Survival is always overlapped, and John can tell you that. Whether it be in 10th Group, using all the Army issued equipment or using civilian equipment, shaking it out, making shelters, melting water out of snow and ice, or in Panama, it was going out and procuring mangoes and bananas, going along the reef and picking limpets off the side of the reef, or fishing for the local fishes, red snapper, and spearing lobster and suffering in the tropical paradise.
I always think when you're down in those places, it's, and I've said this on some of the other shows, especially with the Vietnam vets, you're coming across all the crazy snakes or spiders or whatever else lives in those places. And that'd probably be the worst part, in my opinion.
Yeah. And we had a couple of guys bitten by snakes, and but things get you or they don't. And I very rarely saw a snake down there because a lot of the terrain is overworked by guys. I saw one cross the road once, but I grew up, I could talk for hours about hunting rattlesnakes on the farm and how many rattlesnakes I killed, but I don't seek them out. I try and avoid them. And I guess maybe we made too much noise. We had a lot of monkeys. Monkeys ended up on the barbecue sometimes when we couldn't find pigs. And that's part of the survival camaraderie bonding thing that we did. Every class, we'd have a big barbecue. And on a scuba team, it would be, you do explosive demolition training 1 month. And when you do that, unfortunately, a lot of fish don't make the detonation wave. And we end up having a huge fish fry at the end of whenever we have a demolition training. But
well, they still get put to use, so that's good.
Yeah. And so you asked about the deployments, and the first deployment, that was the whole goal of getting to Panama, was to get a ticket to go to El Salvador, where the only thing's going on. And I got that after being there a few months, 6 months, and I went down there and I was in the first two teams that founded the National Basic Training Center in La Union, El Salvador. And what our restrictions were, we even have social media groups that we have closed groups for called the 55. The State Department came up after Jimmy Carter and just pulled this number out of a hat. And that number is like the speed limit nationally in the United States of America at the time, dreamed up by Jimmy Carter, who pulled it out of a hat. 55 was going to be the limit of advisors in El Salvador at any given time. And so 55 is not divisible by 12. And so some of them were up in the Estado Mayor and the headquarters. And then those teams of us, I went with 2 teams. There's 24 of us right there with our company commander. B team minus, that was 25. That was over the complement, almost half the complement of Special Forces advisors in the country of El Salvador for 3 months. It was going to be 6 months. Unlike Sioux and the combat actions, we didn't have a lot of active combat. We weren't getting shot at every day. We weren't getting ambushed every day, but the potential was always there. So how did that work out for me? I did that twice for 3 months at a time, multiple short trips, like during the election that year in 1984 was a national election in El Salvador. So my team sergeant went to another camp, Santa Ana, and 2 officers replaced 2 special forces guys, 2 like air defense artillery officer and an artillery officer, lieutenant colonel and a major. We're with these 2 conventional guys because they're monitoring the election for Jimmy Carter and crew and Santa Ana, a real pretty town where we were. The only 2 special forces guys there were me and the team sergeant. I was a radio operator in that case. And we're monitoring what activities going on, where attacks might happen. And then we'd go back and another team would take our place in the National Basic Training Center, because that was bringing everyone in El Salvador on the same sheet of music. Instead of these separate brigades having their own SOPs from the Venezuelans or from some other group that had trained them decades before, we got them all on the same doctrine, and we really stayed on top of them about the laws of land warfare and being nice to your people.
Okay.
That was as much a reason for us to be there as anything, is to make sure they don't abuse their populace, they don't execute prisoners, and we weren't allowed to do much active patrolling with them anyway. We were allowed to do none at most of the time.
So you normally would kind of stick to yourselves, like the Americans would stick to themselves?
Well, yes, we had our own sleeping area. We had the cadre of the National Basic Training Center. In that case, we would have our own rooms. If we were hosted at like Santa Ana, 4 of us in a room, the 2 officers, myself, and the team sergeant. Mike Hitcho was the team sergeant at that time. John, I don't know if you knew Mike from up in Devons, but and that might be a picture I can put my hands on of goofing in for the camera with my submachine gun and hand grenades hanging off of me and stuff. But daily occurrences would be accidental discharges. So you're getting guys shot there daily accidentally because you got 1,200 raw recruits at the National Basic Training Center. At Santa Ana, you've just got troops that aren't as disciplined as they should be, but everybody's got a gun that's fully loaded and trip and accidentally shoot each other and got to see a few fatalities. And then in a nutshell of the time there, our buddy Ron, who came, his team went there. And so they were there in between the 2 times I was at the National Basic Training Center. And on the 4th of July, they had an epiphany that morning. We were living off of the camp next to a brigade headquarters, and we were driving in like 9-to-5 jobs or 12-hour jobs to train all day. And then we'd go back because we'd gotten dysentery so bad so many times that we felt it was safer if we had most of the team living in a house and regulated the food and the water.
Yeah.
It was horrible conditions. 1,500 raw recruits, 1 flushing toilet.
Jesus.
Dry season, 85-degree heat, defecation on every bush, every rock, every space you stepped, because there weren't facilities for that many people to be crammed into that new base. And that took 6 months to a year to get working facilities. So during that year, July the 4th, 1984, our team wakes up and they go, you know what? They're always pulling this national holiday stuff on people. For your Canadian listeners, the 4th of July is our Independence Day, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a big thing for us. So the team leader decides, you know what? We're not going to go train. Call them on the phone, tell them we're not coming into work today. And they just took a day off. Well, that day they were going outside of the main camp to an outside range that was not under control, except when you physically occupied it, up near a volcano. And well, the platoon that was to be trained that day said, we're Salvadoran soldiers and we're going to train regardless if the advisors come or not. And so the platoon lieutenant took the 40 guys out there. They stood in a semicircle, and that's when the charge went off, and it killed about 6 of them, including the lieutenant, and it wounded about 30 more. And that was a semicircle series of improvised claymores made out of the flue of a stovepipe.
Jeez.
Packed with explosives and packed with nails and rocks and camouflaged with paper mache to look like rocks. They had strung that up at the place where the formation forms, and it just so happened no Americans showed up that day.
Wow.
But the Salvadorans took a few casualties. And then to get on through that time in El Salvador and stuff, I went up to Fort Bragg to Special Operations Command for the next 16 years. While I was going through my training, listening to the radio would have been my third trip back to that camp. And it got overrun with 60 killed and another 20 died the next day, like 80 people killed in La Union in October of 1985.
That's pretty crazy to think, like, just for like a second of a decision made, right? I'm going this direction instead of this direction. And then boom, people are getting wiped out. Like, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, the way the political situation was, La Union is down on the Gulf of Fonseca. Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador all share that Pacific Gulf for shipping and things. And there's other ports in all the countries, that have that. But they all look at each other over that Gulf. The infiltration routes for the Marxist guerrillas coming from Nicaragua at the time, at the height of the Iran-Contra deal, was up the volcano, land on the beach behind the volcano near us, and then infiltrate the country. They didn't want to really start things with us right there because they're real hot zones like Chalatenango and El Paraíso, those places where they were fighting all the time. They wanted to maintain and be able to resupply them. We were along a main resupply route, and other organizations were responsible for interdicting those supplies.
Okay.
Other U.S. government and Salvadorans. Our job was to train the force, train the entire military, as instructors, along with our cadre counterparts, the Salvadoran non-commissioned officers and officers that were, full-time cadre at that camp. So it was for a year or two that we were starting to have an impact on the battlefield. They decided, hey, they haven't improved the place like the gringos wanted to. It's still a fairly easy target. Let's go hit that target. And we warned them from the first day we were there until it happened of what they should do, but we can't make them do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the balance of being an advisor as opposed to being advisor that also controls the pocketbook. And that was not us. We were we had to deal with the host nation politics.
Yeah.
And how things move. And that'd be true in any country you go to. Some are much more aggressive, forward-leaning, and will take that input. At many levels, the soldiers would, and they would have done anything for us. But the older officers, not so much.
When you're going through a lot of this, like, who are kind of your mentors, your leaders when you're doing a lot of this? Like, is there people that you kind of follow in the footsteps of to like learn how to manage all these things and the politics of it all? And
yeah, and so in the case of a 23-year-old buck sergeant, I had a great team sergeant, Mike Hitcho, that I mentioned earlier, and Mike knew pretty much all the manuals by heart. He was single, and that's all he did was read manuals and practice his skills. And so while I would throw a tantrum and we would scream back in the team room, the master sergeants, maybe with Vietnam experience or whatever, would say, that's not your job. Your job is to be ready for teaching your primary block of instruction tomorrow, which is, defensive positions and clearing fields of fire. or whatever the case may be, or you're going to be an assistant instructor on the marksmanship range, or you're going to be the primary instructor for hand grenades. And that's what you focus on, and make sure I can talk on the radio back to Panama.
Mm.
Don't worry about this. That's why we have the company commander here. That's his job. That's what the guys' jobs are that Stato Mayor. But it is frustrating to see that, and it's in its execution. Often, I believe that what was happening on the ground there was not what the National Command Authority was expecting was happening on the ground there.
Okay.
That it would get watered down by the State Department negotiating with the Department of Defense, the Mill Group. Our Mill Group commander was very aggressive, a fellow by the name of Stringham, and he told us, build an A camp just like you had in Vietnam. We all had the books. We all had the plans. Well, that wasn't our job. It wasn't our camp. It was a Salvadoran camp.
Mm-hmm.
And when their XO, who happens to be the first cousin of a guerrilla commander in that region, when he says no, you have to assume he has a good reason for saying no, other than the fact that his cousin leads the Marxist guerrillas in that region and that he might be a traitorous SOB.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have to go along, get along. And that's very tough for, hard charging special forces guys that, want to do like their predecessors from Vietnam and be out on patrols doing ambushes every night, knowing that the enemy are surveilling you the whole time and taking notes on you to come and attack the camp 18 months later.
Well, and when you're doing this stuff and you're quite young still, like it's, is it kind of mind blowing for you when you're in this stuff and you're going like, maybe I didn't even know where this country was before I got here. And then now I'm like all the politics going on. There's there's killing going on. And, at what point does it kind of hit you and you go like, wow, I'm in the middle of this now?
I tell you how it hit me. And it's because I got that bump on the head when I was 6 years old. We're flying the helicopter out there in El Salvador, besides seeing the people sitting on the side of the streets that were sniffing glue, taking a poop in the median, with their dress pulled up, that kind of thing, garbage burning in the street. This is what chaos and a war zone looks like. You fly over the dams and you see that all the bridges have been dropped previously, and only one dam serves as the road from the capital city out to where we are. Otherwise, you're only going to get there by helicopter. So it's real. And the real feeling was, we've got our handguns, we've got our submachine guns issued by the embassy. Hallelujah, we're finally here. We're in the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is it. It's not Vietnam, but it's the only one we got. Or it's not Korea, or it's not World War II, but it's what every other special forces guy still back at Devens or up at Fort Bragg, that's where they want to be.
Yeah.
Or think they are. And so we had the year previously, one of our guys got shot through the leg. A whole helicopter got shot up when they did a low pass over a guerrilla checkpoint. Salvadoran crew flew by and fired them up with machine guns. We had one of our guys get pretty seriously hit in the femur with a 7.62, I think it was. And so there were some wounded guys, but it was and later casualties. But it was not something that the Marxists were wanting to do. They didn't want to increase the casualty rates on the Americans because they were afraid of what it would do.
Did you make it through most of your career without any injuries of that kind of nature or getting blown up by anything?
Yeah, no Purple Hearts. John's heard a funny story how I got blown up by a flashbang, knocked down a stairwell in Europe one time. And that ended up with a chunk about 1.5 inches into my right calf.
Oh.
But yeah, and that was about a 1/2 inch diameter, but that was just that's just normal training. You catch a flashbang that was meant for somewhere else and it lands on you instead, you get blown up,
Yeah.
But no, the most I got there was a grenade fragment in the neck that burned a hole into my neck, got caught under my little cravat. And the Salvadorans teased me about it because I jumped up and I started knocking the grenade fragment out. It was just a training incident. We had another guy First week there, got excited about opening his brand new full pouch, M16. In my case, it was a grenade launcher. And he stabbed himself in the thigh. And that was fairly shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just an accident, no, I got out of it with no serious injuries the whole career. Multiple impact injuries and stuff. We covered that later, I think you say. So that was the first hostile fire zone. It became a combat zone later. They determined it that. When the camp got overrun that time, one of my closest friends was there when the sappers came through the wire. And the guy who warned him, he stepped out the door. And the guy goes, "They're in the wire. They're right there." And he could see them 50 meters around running satchel charges to throw explosives into the barracks. He steps in to warn the other 2 Americans that were with him. They were all sleeping at the camp that night. When he stepped back out, that guy who had warned him, the Salvadoran guard, was laying there with his head blown up, blown off, shot right in the face. And so in that case, our partner, Bruce, went to the local security company, went to our bunker, and defended the camp that night for another 3 hours. The Salvadoran local guards.
I'm wondering too, when you use the term sapper, that was used in Vietnam, correct? That was like their special forces to counter SOG.
Yeah.
Is that a term that just is used by like the communist parties, or is that like a term that is this someone training that just keeps going along? Like how does that term kind of keep following, from Vietnam to El Salvador?
It's a term that gets misused, and John will get all picky about it. But we actually have
it's not picky when you have facts on your side. But just real quick background: the term sapper actually goes back to at least World War I. Okay. A sap was actually a tunnel that would be dug underneath an enemy trench. They would pack it full of explosives, run out of the tunnel, light the fuse, and they would try to blow a hole in the ground in the enemy breastworks, and then they would time an attack to that. So sappers have always been a kind of military engineer. And then it turned into the Vietnam usage of it, where you had enemy sappers who would strip down, camouflage themselves, and they were specially trained to infiltrate through the barbed wire defenses around a fortification or a camp. And they would leave, they would either leave charges to blow holes in the wire, or they would, they would basically leave little flags that other people could follow in the dark. But that's the usage of the term sapper.
Interesting.
Yep. And the role that we trained, whether it was Dave up in New England or us doing it with the reconnaissance troops we were training, was much like John said, stripped down. There's a famous picture of Salvadoran sappers, Marxist sappers, that were supposedly trained by Vietnamese Marxists, where they're naked. It was a nationally recognized National Geographic picture that was on posters all over El Salvador at the height of the conflict. And they were in loincloths with a Galil or an AK and one little spare mag, on their body. And so they literally were going in barefoot. They were training, paint their bodies and go in barefoot to be able to feel the wire and crawl the wire. And that particular night, it was reported that the guards on the perimeter positions where the wire was not real good, they literally were found the next morning with bamboo sharpened sticks stuck through their throats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they would silently kill the ones on the perimeter and try and get a foothold in there to hit the command and control nodes or hit their designated targets. They had several of the cadre who had built the good defensive minefields and things around there. One of them was targeted for execution, and it didn't work out the way the sapper wanted in that case. And our cadre buddy removed the sapper from the planet. But during the reload, he hid in his shower He was a character of a little guy, only about 5'2", but he was just a wild man. I loved him, and still alive as far as I know. But the sapper threw a grenade in, then ran in and dumped a whole magazine in the guy's bunk area. But he was hiding in a concrete shower. He had rehearsed it.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't had time to rifle, but he had his 45. That's the story we heard, and it sounds just like something he would do. He waited till the guy reloaded, and then he commented to the guy, "You messed up," and then he shot him, and he lived to tell the tale. So it sounds like, I've seen him engage with his troops. It sounds exactly like something he would do. But so Nathan, I'm going to jump ahead here because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
You asked about later, in '85, I went back to Fort Bragg, and I spent the rest of my career at Fort Bragg working at USASOC. In 1993, I went back to El Salvador and closed out at the end of the war, being an advisor for the reconnaissance element down there, the Grupo de Operaciones Especiales, the SOG equivalent. They were Mike Force templated from Vietnam by former Mike Force members. So their formation and organization throughout the conflict and since then was based off the Mike Force construct with reconnaissance and assault companies.
Okay.
And so I got to be the last advisor, the last permanent advisor down there for a year in '93 after the war had ended. And that was fun. And then I went right back to Fort Bragg. And while I was at Fort Bragg, that was the worldwide deployment mission set. And so what I didn't get in Tropic and Arctic and all that, we did that every 18 months at a minimum, sometimes once a year. I got Halo qualified as soon as I got back there, high altitude, low opening. I was already a jump master from my Panama time, static line jump master, and I was one of the few jump masters available. So within a year of being back at Fort Bragg, I became a Halo jump master. And so now I'm putting out Halo passes from about 1986 on till I retired in 2001 and doing bizarre. So the infiltration methodology is now, the way we look at it and the way we're packed up and where we're ready to go is with refueling. There's no place on the planet that special operations guys can't land to attack you or to attack the enemy.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan would be a good example of that. So I hear some of that happen. And so it's not telegraphed, but it's a capability that, just adds to the dynamic of how do you get into a denied area. And so that rounded me out that way. And then a main focus in the years of the 80s and the early 90s was Beirut was still a mess. There were still hostages being taken over there. We were always on the look for how do we get them out of there. And the Middle East is going up and down all the time. So desert training became a regular thing, and doing infiltration by helicopter, infiltration by parachute, walking in, vehicles being used, a lot of motorcycles, a lot of ATVs, a lot of different types of vehicles that are non-standard to be able to infiltrate using host nation, and then working in the Middle East as well. But Panama popped up in '89, went to Panama for that, got to watch all the shooting from my helicopter as we were waiting for a go on our helicopter. Got to watch all the parachute plane, all the planes that dropped the parachutists, the jumpers coming in and landing to refuel. Close friends of mine got shot. Close friends of mine got seriously injured. And a lot of bad people got permanently injured. So the Panama thing went well. The mission I was on was to get Noriega, but he was kind of elusive. So at the end of the 2 weeks, I literally was sitting there looking at the Papal Nunciatoria, the papal embassy, while Noriega was in there. I was on the rooftop right above the perimeter for a period of a week or so, as I recall.
Okay.
And until we rotated out until he finally surrendered and came out. There was a lot of action in a short period of time, with me not doing any shooting to speak of or getting shot at, but a lot of people getting grabbed, a lot of people being, stopped at checkpoints and pulled off to put into one group or another group.
I think a lot of maybe people get their ideas of like what special forces might be just from movies, right? And they just think it's all crazy combat and explosions all the time. But and we see this in even the law enforcement side where it's like, well, 99% of my job is paperwork because to do anything, you got to write a ton of paper now. But
Right.
it's not the movies, right? It's there's so much that goes on in between the start of something and the conclusion, and just, you know, people getting snatched, politics, like it just before bullets start flying, oftentimes something's going to happen that's going to change the whole trajectory. So, like you're saying, like you could go on all these deployments, but it doesn't mean you're in, you know, intense machine gun fire
Right.
fights all the time, because there's a lot of other people involved and things happening. One of the things I want to also kind of make sure we cover is, so you retire in 2002, but where were you and what was kind of your reaction to 9/11
Right.
and what happened around that time
Yeah.
for you?
I'm gonna cover that next.
Yep.
But I am gonna say Desert Storm comes up the next year.
Yep.
And I went to Desert Storm and did reconnaissance stuff. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that or not. And that's where I did actually get shot at, and I slept through it.
No, go ahead. We have time.
Well, I don't want to lose. I don't want to lose the 9/11 piece. I'm going to let you get a chance, and I'll go back and talk about that. But on 9/11, I had literally had my retirement ceremony with my mother and all my brothers and sisters in July of 2001.
Okay.
My first day to start a new job working advising the Department of Defense was going to be 1st September 2001.
Mm.
However, two guys in my office, I was working in combat developments at the time, like is in my resume and things, the CV, and that is developing technology for special operations. Night vision was what I had evolved to, doing that for 2 years, being a directorate level position, working with all four services. And so, unfortunately, in our office, two guys retired as my replacement came on. So now we have, in our organizations, you don't have one project to work on all year. You got like 6 different projects, and 6 more will come 3 months from now. And so you're working all these projects based on available resources and what can feasibly done by the laws of physics, and negotiating all that while you're trying to get money and fight for the money against your counterparts who work in another commodity area. So my replacement got overwhelmed, and he got sent so that he couldn't be trained up on all the projects I had. So I went to the command and I said, look, I need to extend a month to give this guy don't be stupid, extend until the new fiscal year. And that way, until the new calendar year, and that way you'll have that retirement, blah, blah, blah. So that's what I did. I put in an extension until the following January.
Oh, okay.
And I was literally still there when 9/11 happened, coming into work on a retired on active duty type attitude, because I literally had my retirement ceremony. I'd turned in most of my equipment when all hell breaks loose, right?
Mm.
So I had to go through soul searching and decide if I was going to tell the company I was not going to work for them, that I was going to re-enlist for 6 years or something, and go back and tell my aged mother that I was not coming back to the farm to help her out. And at the time, I had a 5-year-old and twin 2-year-olds.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And I was a single father sharing them for custody. So I decided it would be best and to go on and move on. I got a call over that December. Hey, we'd like you to come back. And I'm like, well, what they offered me was not exciting. And it didn't seem like they really needed me if that was the best they could come up with. I mean, I literally had a call after I'd already started working for a company. And I went back there and advised multiple times over the next several years, back to Fort Bragg. And John and I were constantly in meetings with them, listening to their stories as they came back, which is how I got to meet Sue LaRue later. Was at one of those months-long or 3-week-long weapons training events for the SCAR rifle. But so that'll haunt me my whole life. On did I make the right decision? But I'm living the dream now, having retired twice, and I didn't get dead. There is that to, be happy about.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, that would be very hard to keep going, and you got very young kids at home, single parent. Like,
Yeah, every other weekend for the next 10 years, I was with them, and 2 or 3 weeks in the summer. Had I gone on back-to-back deployments, that wouldn't have been the case, and they wouldn't be successful where they are with their college degrees and moving on in life. But it does kind of get under your skin. But by the same token, the same complaints John and I would sit there and hear, "Oh, you don't know how it is." Oh, let's see. Rules of engagement, frustrations by soldiers in a combat zone. No, I wouldn't know anything about that. Being restricted so that you can't go out and do the operations the way you think. Oh, not having the resources brought to you forward. Dysentery, fever, all the things that go along with it. Yeah. So in hindsight, I don't think it would have meant that much, one way or the other.
your transition to civilian life sounds like it was pretty smooth because you already had stuff lined up.
Right.
But how did you kind of take it? Like, you aren't deploying anymore. It's not as action filled. What was that like for you?
I had a fellow background. I retired and went back to Fort Benning, Columbus, Georgia for 3 years and worked for a company that had a branch down there, even though we're out of Northern Virginia. And so I got to meet soldiers and work with soldiers. That aided in the transition. But a guy once asked me, he goes, "Well, how do you like civilian life?" And I go, "I like it just fine. I was an expert civilian before I ever started all this stuff."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I got the farm down in Georgia. I made sure that we lined it up so that my siblings own that farm, and we helped my mother transition to her retired life. And before she passed away, we took ownership of all that, and that's another level of responsibility. So there's that, and then there's the other side of the joke, which I say I never have. I still use the same formats. We use the same formats in business because most of our business is related towards DOD. If it were purely civilian business, just a business, well, my first office manager had done that prior to being our office manager. He'd been working in a Walmart. He'd been the manager of all the employees at Walmart. He used the same templates for counseling that he used when he was a non-commissioned officer in the Army. It's about being on time, having the right equipment, and knowing what your duties and responsibilities are, and not falling off on any of those. And so if you're not going to show up on time and you're not going to have the equipment you need, he's going to counsel you until the point that he's going to remove you from the employee workforce.
Yep.
After the third counseling. And if you don't apply those disciplines, then you're going to have a crap civilian workforce doing a crap work job,
That's one thing that I really appreciate about the military and the things that it could provide for, especially for young adults, is those things like discipline, hard work. You get kind of like a standard operating procedure that you can use and transition into any aspect of a civilian life. And that's why, like, if you see some of the debates now about, like, should law enforcement have a university degree? And it's like, yeah, maybe you learn a certain way to think, but I honestly think the military stuff translates the most into what you're doing. Everybody out there, the naysayers, might say, well, it teaches you how to kill or something. It's like, it teaches you discipline. It teaches you hard work. It teaches you how to prioritize, like, necessary skills for any aspect of your life. So, yeah. And I mean, for you, you're still very connected to that military world, right? So you're advising in there. And then, I mean, going home to the farm is just kind of going back to your memories in another part of your life that you, it's just family and stuff. So it sounds like a pretty good transition that you had.
Right. And some of it was it's hard to argue with it when you're the one making the decision. Like I tell my children, you got a decision to make. You got to choose one path or the other. When you make that decision, don't second guess it. That's the decision you made. It's in the past. Now, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Are you going to make sure that you succeed in the way you envision before you made that decision? Because it's too late to take that decision back. You made it. You might have contractual obligations that go along with that. So do the best you can until there's a time when you have another decision point you'd like to make. And so that's kind of the way I look at it. And so getting to where I'm happy with what we've built, those were decisions we made. They're not without frustrations. I'm in business with my siblings. We don't necessarily vote the same way.
Yeah.
We carry on business meetings, and we love each other, and we express that from time to time. But I don't go to socialize with them for days on end because of the possible political ramifications of it, going out of control. So those decisions were developed and planned to aid that transition,
Yeah. Well, and just in retirement, so you've been focused on developing some of the night vision stuff, the night vision for the military?
Yeah. Several of the things that you see we did on active duty and special operations. And I had the opportunity and when an interview, do I want to go and work for one of the best companies that makes and delivers to the Department of Defense night vision equipment? And I thanked them for hosting me for interviews back there 20 years ago, but they wanted me to reside in New England, and I refused. I said, no, I love your company. Your company does great things. We'll probably see you in the future. And I got offered a job to do broader problem solving advisement, which included multiple times over the last 20 years night vision advisement. To include the last desk job I had was working at a company that for a military organization, program executive office soldier at Fort Belvoir, that it is their duty and responsibility to develop, design, program, get the manufacturers to make it in accordance with the specifications and requirements, and then issue it to the entire Army. Yeah, in the case of small arms, that would be all four services because the Army is the lead agency for development of small arms. They don't always follow that nice cookie cutter path, but they have that responsibility and they get that funding to, test, evaluate, improve the small arms, and with small arms, the sighting system developed for those. So in that case, yeah, I might write up the requirements. I did before I retired, along with a couple of other people having epiphanies, and it was in direct contravention to the U.S. Army plans for night vision weapons development, thermal imagers and things like that. They had been issuing us 3-pound thermal weapon sights. You have to push your eye up on the back of the cup to get it to turn on. Ergonomically idiotic. Very power hungry, very cumbersome on top of your weapon. I had done that in Desert Storm with a similar image intensified device, and it made for a very cumbersome battlefield experience in carrying daily for weeks on end, and brought with all types of problems. So we evolved it where we did the inline that you see now everywhere. I wrote the original requirements for that, along with another one of John's mates, my friend. We shared that, but I was the overall in charge of that commodity area. So we did the inline in multiple different ways for image intensified and thermal after being told for decades it could not be done. And we just let solicitations while I was still in active duty. And it was demonstrated shortly after I had retired. And that was all post 9/11. And we were able to find new money coming in for the operations to get that pushed out to the tip of the spear in record time.
Is it, maybe you know or not, but I had heard before that I think it's U.S. I don't know if it's the government, but they own the rights, or they own the technology of night vision. So like nobody else has it, or they don't share it with anybody necessarily. And I got this from a conversation I had with one of our air ambulance STARS service. And the way they got access to night vision for their pilots was whoever the president was at the time in this story, he was coming up to Kananaskis area, or Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And they had like this whole plan. Like if something happened to the president, we have to evacuate him. And they said, well, we can't fly at this certain time, into this area because we don't have night vision. So they made this exception and gave these pilots access to night vision, and that's how they now have it. So what do you know, like what's the level of technology that is allowed outside of the US when it comes to that?
When I can't remember, John, if it's called the Five Eyes or whatever, but our partners of Australia, UK, Canada, those exceptions are written in for the State Department and the Department of Defense on who they can be sold to and who they can be shared with.
Okay.
And sometimes that's information as well. So, and the classification guidelines on operations and on tactics, techniques, and procedures. So the night vision, I know that for image intensifiers, for example, those are grown in laboratories and they have a high failure rate. And they come in categories of that from the top of the line for aviation goggles on down in prioritization. So they don't have any peers compared to the laboratories that have developed the image intensifiers are concerned. Thermal imagers, not so much. Those are made in Europe and all over the world now that are near peer capability, with a few caveats of things that are put on to make them a little bit lighter weight, better. But yeah, in that case, it would have been the aviation grade goggles that were all spoken for and focus on deploying to our top tier aviators and special operations guys.
We do have a bit of time left. Can you tell us your experience in Desert Storm?
Yeah, mine was it was fairly boring, and I got to watch the war like everybody else did. And I say fairly boring. It was very exciting. We got to go in during the air war. And so the books that are written on it, no one from my patrol wrote a book. So before the ground war started, February 7th was when I went in, and I went up near the Syrian border, not too far south of Al Qaim. And I was in there for 2 weeks, 11 days, basically. And so when you asked about how was it when you deployed, well, that particular conflict was, we're in the big leagues now, because everything you're watching of the anti-aircraft fire going up, once we got on the ground, 100, 150, 120 miles, something like that, behind enemy lines, it was middle of the night, and every direction of the compass was anti-aircraft fire going up that we could see with our goggles to infinity, and then bomb drops detonating pretty much 270 degrees of the compass, So we're like, hey, we're in the big leagues now. This is the real thing. And essentially for 2 weeks, we were invisible. We did the camouflage business right. We didn't get compromised. We did direct bombs being dropped on targets, and successfully. 2 days after I came out, since this is, you're in conjunction with, like your Memorial Day, my boss had rotated in with us, my sergeant major, one of my neighbors as well. And he got injured, and they went to medevac him. The two medics that went in, one of them was my next door neighbor, lived right across the road from me. My boss had been my team sergeant, and then later he's my sergeant major. We'd known each other. We were close hunting buddies for 4 years, known him for 5 years. So that whole crew got killed that night as they were coming back in. So all 4 crewmen, the 2 medics, and our sergeant major all got killed. And that was, again, before the ground war ever kicked off.
Wow.
So ground war kicked off like 2 days later, I think the 21st. He was killed on the 20th. Dealing with that, it's just a matter of, we have the chain of command. We had another guy that was standing up to be the sergeant major. He takes over that next day, and we continue to train for follow-on missions that, because the war happened in 100 hours, we didn't go back in. During that whole time, we had other patrols that were out that were doing the mission and have an effect on the battlefield.
You said there was a story where you sleep through getting shot at?
Yeah, we flew. We flew out in a. I believe I was in a 53. I know I was in a 53 with the CH-53 Air Force aircraft, and we had crammed some vehicles in there with it, and we'd been on the ground for over 11 days, not sleeping very much at all, patrolling all night long, hiding during the daytime, reporting during the daytime, dropping bombs, on targets when we saw them. And on the way out, they fired missiles at our helicopter, and the flares fired. And on the 53, they've got a 50 cal position on the back ramp, and the 50 cal fired in return, which I would not have advised if you've got heat-seeking missiles coming at the back of your helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
I would have advised him not to shoot the 50 cal. But I woke up, and a gas can fell and bang, an empty gas can fell and banged me on the head. I had no room to move. I had no window to stick my gun out of to shoot at anything to hit anyway. And so I just laid down and went to sleep. And the next morning, that was the talk of everybody who'd come back. Hey, it wasn't that exciting when we got, the missiles shot at us and the 50 cal was going off and the flares flying and everything. I go, I don't recall that. And then in a vague haze, I do recall it. I'm like, I can't believe you slept through that. We were so excited the rest of the return flight. I'm like, if I'm on an aircraft under someone else's control and there's time to sleep, I'm probably going to sleep.
Yeah.
Until it's time to, wake up and don the equipment, because there's nothing under my control at that point that,
You know what? We're just coming up to the end of the time here. I want to say it. I appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks to John for also telling you to come on the show and getting you on here. I think it's always great to get these stories out and talk about everyone's experiences. So yeah, I want to say thank you for your service and all the stuff you've done and continue to do. So yeah, I'll say bye offline, but thank you guys for being on here today.
Appreciate it.
All right. I sure appreciate it, Nathan. My pleasure.